The books I read in the second half of January were excellent on the whole, even if the world events transpiring were not so excellent, but we're not here to talk about that, we're here to talk about the books. So I have several books I finished, and then I have a TBR, several books for my TBR, that I'm gonna run through very quickly. We're gonna go in the order I read them in, so the first up is Song of the Lark by Willa Cather. This was published in 1915. It's about Thea Kronborg, who is a young girl who's born and raised in the sort of backwater town in Colorado in the mid-19th century, and this is the story of her working her way up to becoming a great opera singer who performs at the Metropolitan Opera. And, this story clicks so many buttons for me. It's about an artist, a performing artist in particular, which are stories that I love. It's about the American West and the landscape of the American West, and it's also obviously about opera. And it's also a coming-of-age story. So, it just clicks a lot of buttons, and, was basically guaranteed to be a home run. And it definitely was. I really, really liked the Song of the Lark. It was just a joy to read, written in very simple, clean, clear prose, which occasionally worked to its detriment, but only occasionally. On the whole, the prose just made it very easy to read, even though it is a bit longer and a very slow-moving story, and I really liked it. And I also made a video about this one, so I'll leave a link to that. Second book I read was Blue Nights by Joan Didion. This is her memoir published in 2009. That is sort of a sequel to The Year of Magical Thinking, which was a memoir all about her experiences and thoughts following the very sudden death of her husband. This book is about her sort of thoughts and experiences following her daughter's death, who died not too long after her husband died. It's a lot less straightforward than The Year of Magical Thinking, a lot more non-linear. She kind of drifts from thought to thought without too much direction. This really is more of just a general meditation on loss and death. And I actually ended up liking it more than The Year of Magical Thinking. In fact, I regret that I made my top 10 nonfiction books tag before I finished this, because I honestly think this would have a chance of making it on the list. I'm not sure what it would replace, but I think it could get onto the list, because it's just been so long since any book, fiction or nonfiction, has made me think and feel so much in such a long time. And yeah, I just loved it, and I do highly recommend this one, and I also made a video about it, so I will leave a link to that as well. Next up is a buddy read. I read The Medea by Euripides with Madeline from Made with Books, Roz from Scallydandling about the books, and Mark from Words Everywhere. We are doing a sort of ongoing buddy read of a bunch of Euripides plays. We're reading one play per month, and one of us is choosing the play every month, and I believe it may have been myself who chose this play. Anyway, we read the Medea together this month. So I'm sure many of you know the story of Jason and the Argonauts, where Medea makes an appearance, but just in case, Medea is this sort of witch, this sort of woman with a lot of powers who helps Jason and the Argonauts to get the Golden Fleece, and also falls in love with Jason and marries him. And this play takes place several years after those events have transpired, and Medea and Jason are living as a married couple, and Medea has given birth to 2 sons. And what happens in this play is at the beginning of the play we find out that Jason has decided to leave Medea for a new wife. And Medea is absolutely incensed because she loves Jason, for one thing, but also because, she did this great service to him in his journey for the Golden Fleece. And so she's understandably very pissed off, and her reaction is to resolve to murder their 2 sons to punish Jason and make him live with, his 2 dead children for the rest of his life. And it's so complicated to talk about this play. It's so complicated to talk about any Euripides play, because there's always sort of 2 sides to things. Jason is not exactly someone you feel bad for or sympathize with, but he is still portrayed with a lot of depth. He's very clearly a sort of spoiled prince who was kind of amazed that anyone would even disagree with something he wanted to do. You get the sense that he didn't even expect that Medea would be upset at his choice. So he's kind of a clueless, insensitive prick. But he's still portrayed with so much psychological depth that you can still sort of feel bad for him, in the sense that, like, wow, how terrible to be that clueless, And Medea, you obviously sympathize with her and what you know, she's being abandoned like this. But also, like, how can you justify her reaction? Because it's so horrific. And why should these young children have to suffer for, you know, their father's sins? And, you know, and on top of that, Medea isn't entirely vicious. I mean, she wavers. You know, there's a very powerful scene where she, sort of has to force herself to go through with what she's doing, because obviously she loves her children. And so, like all of Euripides' plays, this just raises a lot of really difficult questions about, you know, right and wrong, who's in the right, who's in the wrong, what kind of punishment is, you know, is appropriate for a certain crime. And it's also kind of a feminist play in a certain sense. Medea and the chorus of women in this play do sort of go on a long rant about how, you know, this sort of thing is done to women and they're supposed to just sort of take it lying down. And so it is very much sort of ahead of its time in that sense. So yeah, as always, I loved it. I love pretty much everything by Euripides. For the next book, we're sticking with the ancient world. This is Lucan, Civil War. So this is an epic poem about the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Lucan did not manage to finish this. It's only 10 books long. It was supposed to be, as many scholars suppose, it was supposed to be 12 books long, like the Aeneid. And it just tells of the campaigns of Pompey and Caesar in this war against one another. And Julius Caesar and Pompey are two of the main characters, obviously, and then the third is Cato, who is a general who fights under Pompey. And I ended up finding this very, very interesting. It's a strikingly modern poem, just in its sort of cynicism and the brutality with which the war is portrayed. There's no sort of attempt to make fighting heroic in any way. There's just a sort of calling into question a lot of the conventions of the sort of view of mythological view of the world, because of the grittiness with which the war is portrayed, and the fact that it ends so bleakly. You know, at the end of this book, Pompey is dead. We know through historical events that Cato will commit suicide, and Caesar is left in power, and Caesar again is portrayed as this monomaniacal tyrant. And so it was just strikingly modern in how brutally realistic it was. And I did a video about this one, so I'll leave a link to that if you want to get my, like, more fleshed out thoughts on it. But I wanted to give a shout out to this edition. So this is the Oxford World's Classics edition. It's by Susan Brown, who did the translation and also the introduction and notes. Susan Brown graduated from King's College, Cambridge, and she is now, I believe, at the Classics Department at the University of British Columbia. The author bio here is a little out of date. And her translation is a free verse translation, and it's just lovely. It's just beautiful. I loved it. Her introduction is really nicely explanatory of a lot of the major themes of this book and the background with, like, Lucan's life and the events that were going on when he was alive. And the endnotes are also very good. They're very explanatory. They point out things that you might not get if you don't know the sort of history of the time or the culture of Rome and such. And there are also very brief plot summaries for each section of each book in the end notes. And that can be very helpful because the poem can be kind of difficult to follow at times. So, yeah, a great, great edition. I would highly recommend it. Yeah, so anyway, that was a good read. It was a hard poem for me to get into at first. It's not, I would say, the most enjoyable epic poem to come out of the ancient world. But, again, I found it very interesting. The last book I finished was a book that I'm reading for Britta Bowlers and Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, Read German Books in 2020. This is The Land of Green Plums by Herta Müller. This was first published in 1994. The translation by Michael Hoffman was published in 1996. Herta Müller won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2009. And as I understand it, when she won the Nobel Prize, sales of this particular novel, like, skyrocketed. And anyway, this novel tells the story of 4 university students living in under the communist regime in Romania in the 1980s, under the Ceausescu regime. I think I might be pronouncing that correctly. Ceausescu's regime in Romania. And basically what it's about is, it's really just about the sort of psychological effect on individuals of living under a totalitarian regime. When I learned about totalitarian regimes like the communist regimes of the 20th century, in schools. I remember learning about, very sort of macroscopic, broad things like censorship, secret police dealings, the corruption, the dictators' sort of use of absolute power and such. But we didn't necessarily learn that much about the real trauma that living in a society like that, where, you could, at any point, you could start being followed by someone because you were doing something that the government perceived as subversive, or you could be arrested and interrogated at a moment's notice and made to strip naked at that interrogation. And, anyone could be an informer on the police. This novel is about that, about the real trauma that has on people over time. And I found this to be a difficult book to get into. It's not a quick read. It took me almost the whole month to get through, even though it's very short, because it's not plot-driven by any means. It also kind of skips around in time and place, which keeps you from feeling sort of settled in the story. It sort of creates a certain amount of distance between you and the characters. And also just the sort of pithy sentences it's written in kind of keep you at a distance in a sense. And that gave it, the whole novel, a sort of atmosphere of claustrophobia for me. There was actually a sort of moment where I was reading it where I thought to myself, it kind of feels like the characters in this novel are all ghosts. And I think that's a really interesting way to portray living under an authoritarian regime. So I found it very interesting, and I liked that it sort of explored that more human aspect of the effects of being under a totalitarian regime like this. But I guess I wouldn't quite call it a favorite, just because, again, it was hard for me to get really into it. There's not really that much actual, character development or plot. So if that is your thing, it's not going to be great. There are some sentences that I just loved, some brilliant sentence making in this book. Even when I didn't quite understand what the sentences were saying, I would just be like, wow, that is gorgeous. So it is a good novel, I think. Just maybe not quite my cup of tea, but I think it was a good start to the Read German Books 2020. So those are the books that I have read this month, or the second half of this month. I'm now going to move into rattling off my TBR for the next month. Usually I don't do TBRs, but I have a lot of buddy reads and read-alongs and such going on, and one or two books that I might try to sort of chip away at this month. So the first, which I've already mentioned, is I'm going to be reading Electra by Euripides with Madeline, Mark, and Roz. So that should be great. I love Electra. Another book I want to start reading is this. This is Bach's Musical Universe, The Composer and His Work by Christoph Wolff. This is just all about Bach's major pieces of music, and also a little bit about his life. Christoph Wolff actually wrote a biography of J.S. Bach, and this is supposed to be a kind of companion piece to that. I haven't read that biography, which worries me a little bit, but I have started it already, and I'm liking it. So yeah, so I'll be listening to a lot of Bach this month, and hopefully getting a lot more out of it, because I'll be reading a book about it. And I'm also going to be writing a review of that for Open Letters Review. Steve Donahue sent me this copy. It's actually an advance uncorrected proof. So yeah, anyway, there's that. Next, of course, is Sagalong. So I will be reading the Saga of the People of Laxdaela, and also the Saga of the People of Vatnsdala. So for the first 2 weeks of February, I and several other booktubers whose names I'm not going to remember, but I'll leave links to everyone's announcement videos for the Sagalong. We're going to be reading the Laxdaela Saga together, and then each of us is going to be covering a different saga for the second 2 weeks, and I'm doing the Vatnsdala Saga, so that should be fun. I love the sagas. And then this is a buddy read with Loretta Webb, Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, which I'm already about 50 pages into it, finding it very, very interesting. And yet another buddy read, this is The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, which I'm also about 50 pages into, and that's a buddy read with Sharon Goforth. An ongoing buddy read that I started last month, and which will, I think, come to an end at the end of this month, is Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. I'm buddy reading this with Patrice Jones, a regular commenter who I'm sure many of you know. We're just exactly halfway through it, and we're both just loving it. It's just fantastic. Fantastic biography of Abraham Lincoln, fantastic history of the Civil War. It's really, really good. I may also this month try to make my way through some of the poetry of William Blake. Noah, over at Everyone Who Reads It Must Converse, just did a video recently called A Beginner's Guide to William Blake, and had a lot of suggestions for making your way through the work of William Blake, because he is kind of a bit of an obscure poet. He has kind of a lot of intricate kind of mythological systems that you kind of need to understand to get a lot of it out of his poetry. And Noah did a video about how to get into Blake's poetry more. So I will be chipping away at some of that. Some of his shorter poems, not his long poems probably yet. And something that I will be that I will be using to help me along in that process is this. This is Alchemy and Mysticism by Alexander Rube. This is just a bunch of sort of mystical paintings, sort of, that have explanatory annotations along with them. I hope you can see that. But yeah, Noah recommended this as a great companion to Blake, and before you guys start crying out that I have broken with my year of no buying, I did say that one of the exceptions to that no buy year was books where you don't start it at the beginning and read to the end, which this isn't, because again, it's just like paintings with annotations, so it's not a book that I would ever start at the beginning and read to the end anyway, so it doesn't destroy my year of reading one's own. I also have a volume of Blake's paintings that I'm going to get for my birthday next week, from my mom, I think. And again, that doesn't break with the year of reading one's own, because again, that isn't something that you read through, so it doesn't count, sort of. But anyway, I'll be using this to help me along to get through Blake. And then another work of poetry that I want to work through is this. So this is just the Selected Works of Samuel Beckett, Volume 4, and this includes some of his poems, and I want to read all of the poems by him that are in here. I've read about half of them, but a lot of the ones that I haven't read yet are quite long, so yeah, I just want to read all the poetry in this. At some point, I'll also have to get around to his short fiction that's in here, because I haven't read any of that. Eventually, I want to do a sort of beginner's guide to Samuel Beckett once I've read a bit more, read his works a bit more comprehensively. And then finally, the last book is not something that I have on a hard TBR or anything, but this is The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Yeah, the reason I think I might try to read at least some of this month is because Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, in their books that I've just held up, in both of those books, they cite Sigmund Freud in, like, the first 5 pages or so. So that just kind of inspired me to want to try to read this book, which has been on my TBR for a long time. So I may get to this, but obviously I have a lot to get through this month. So we will see. And I also have I have a conference at the end of this month from the 27th to the 29th. So I'll have that to worry about. I'm also presenting the poster that I'm presenting at the conference. I am presenting a week before the conference at our psychology department seminar. So I'll have to be I'll have all that on my mind, as well as all these buddy reads and read-alongs. So I just don't know if I'll have room for, like, the Interpretation of Dreams, which is a long book, but we will see. Anyway, that was a January wrap-up and a February sort of kind of TBR. So give me your thoughts if you are interested in any of these books, and thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you all. I will talk to you all later. Bye, guys.